I would strongly advise when it comes to your mobility that you pick things that you need to do and pick things that potentially your workout isn't going to cover. Welcome to the Smart Strength Training Podcast. We are on podcast episode 50, and I'm going to try and tell you everything you need to know about improving your mobility in a short podcast. And the reason I want to do this is because I was recently asked on my Q&A that is mobility training worthwhile, because this person found mobility really boring. And then it got me thinking, because I answered the question on my stories thinking it didn't really give it a fair crack at an answer. What I said to answer the question is effectively, if you think about every single component of physical, like a physical attribute for human beings that we can impact with exercise as these physical attributes. So we can increase someone's strength and their overall muscularity. We can increase someone's power output, their force production output. We can improve their cardiovascular fitness. And then within cardiovascular fitness, you can break it down into subcategories of different kinds of cardiovascular fitness. And then I guess we can think of like movement quality as a whole. And then within that, we have mobility and flexibility. And like I said, you could break these down further. And the way that I answered it, and I stand by that answer, but I want to go into more detail, is if you're new to exercise and you're generally quite weak and your cardiovascular fitness isn't great, I think there's more important things to touch on than mobility at first. But if I look around the weights room, I see a lot of gym bros who are very muscular. Probably they could do with actually focusing a bit more on mobility. And if I think about some people I've trained that like do a lot of running and they don't do any sort of supplementary work with strength or mobility, then probably actually their cardiovascular fitness is really high. And maybe they should focus more on some strength training and some mobility overall. So just telling people to do more mobility and how important it is, I don't think is really worthwhile. You've got to think about, what do you need right now? Think of all those attributes I spoke about as being buckets that you want to try and keep as full as possible. So for some people, if you're not doing any mobility and you're doing lots of cardio and strength training, I think mobility could be really important. Then I do watch some people, I'm not going to pick on yogis too much here, but like I watch people who've got really impressive feats of mobility, flexibility, and they're doing loads of it in their workout. It's like, well, you're probably better off doing other things. Like there's probably other buckets that aren't full enough, like maybe get stronger, maybe get more powerful, maybe improve your cardiovascular function. So the reality is only you would know what is the most important thing for you to do right now. Let's define mobility and let's talk about maybe the difference between mobility and flexibility. So flexibility is the ability to elongate a muscle to effectively express a range of motion at a joint, and that is usually passive. So we think of that as like a static form of stretching. So if you were to sit on the floor, put one leg out in front of you, and you would lean forward and try and touch your toes, and that would lengthen the structures underneath the leg, the back of the hip up into the lower back, and you would hold that for time. So that would be a form of, or a physical attribute of elongation of a muscle overall. Whereas mobility has this more element of control, like neuromuscular control and strength. So we can think of mobility more as a flexibility component with a strength attribute on top. So we think about this from what's the difference from an exercise standpoint. Let's think about the ankle. If I was doing a flexibility exercise with the ankle, I would stand on a step. I'd have my toes and the front of my foot on the step. I'd allow my heels to drop down towards the floor, and I would hold that for time. So I'd hold that for, let's say, a minute, 90 seconds. That would elongate the calf, the soleus muscle, the Achilles tendon, not that you stretch tendons, but you'd put a form of length into those structures overall. Whereas a mobility exercise, so that's effectively creating that shin angle coming forward towards the top of the foot. It's creating what we call ankle dorsiflexion. But a mobility exercise could be, now we're standing on top of a box and we're going to squat down. We're going to have a box that's got a flat surface. The leg that's coming down is in contact with that box. But we're bending the foot, we're bending the ankle that's on the box, so the shin travels forward. So we're getting ankle mobility, that ankle dorsiflexion, whilst controlling our body through space on the way down, and then we would contract to come back up. So we've got that mobility, that active quality of control, rather than just being passive. So I think what's a nice thing to consider when it comes to mobility as a whole is that actually exercises do have, certainly strength exercises where you go through a full range of motion or good amounts of range of motion, they have that element of control mobility in them. That's not going to cover all your bases. For example, if you've got a really, really tight like ankle on the right side, so you're unable, let's say you can test ankle mobility. If you stand next to a wall, put your toe against the wall, push one knee towards the wall, the knee will touch the wall, pull the foot back and keep doing that until your knee can only just touch the wall and the foot doesn't come off the floor. You can do it on the other side. If you've got a noticeable difference in one side compared to the other, then you can tell if your ankle mobility is poor. If you're doing a step down, that exercise that I spoke about, and you've got really poor ankle mobility on the right side, because of the complexity of that exercise, balance, ankle flexion, the foot has to pronate and do other things. The knee has to bend, the hip has to flex, and you're just trying to stack all your joints above it. There's so much stuff going on in that situation. If I was trying to actively open out a range of motion on that right ankle, let's say, because it's the more bunged up side, I'm going to need supplementary mobility, maybe even flexibility where I do static holds to try and improve that. Because as much as you get components of mobility in strength training, if you've got a really clear deficit one side compared to the other, then you're probably going to find your strength training isn't going to get there unless you're really good at that exercise. Because what's going to happen is you're going to compensate. If the ankle can't bend, then the hip's going to do something more. The spine might have to take up motion to facilitate what the ankle can't do. So it is important sort of to recognize that, because there's often a question like, what's more important, flexibility or mobility? Well, they're both important and they both happen together. But when I think of mobility and when I watch people do mobility in the gym, like let's talk about the classic like runners warm up. Sorry to pick on runners. Like you stick your leg up on a ballet bar, you lean forward for a little bit, then you grab your heel and pull it towards your arse and just do some static stretching. It's probably not going to do an awful lot. Most people don't hold those for long enough, and potentially those structures don't actually need to be mobilized. So it's not that one is better than the other. It really depends on what someone wants. What I think about static stretching is static stretching can often get bad press. And I will state that historically, I've probably been a bit negative around static stretching. One of the great things around sort of like cool down exercises, end of the workout, sitting on the floor, reaching forward and touching your toes, and breathing into that movement. It can be a really nice way to down-regulate tissue tone. Think of the word tone. When people think of the word tone, they think, oh, it sounds really good, like a muscle looks really toned. But if a muscle is hypertonic and there's too much tissue tone, it means the brain is sending a signal to that muscle to contract, and therefore it's too switched on. So going into a position, breathing helps to down-regulate that tissue tone. It taps into the parasympathetic nervous system, and it helps to sort of like really sort of switch towards that rest and digest. So very, very good for relaxation. I probably wouldn't do a ton of that prior to training. There's research that shows, certainly if you do really long forms of static long stretches, like 90 seconds to 2 minutes, let's say, for example, that calf stretch, drop your heel off the edge of a step, hold it for 2 minutes, and then you would instantly went to go and sprint, that probably wouldn't end so well. Like it would reduce power output because you've lengthened those structures, and that's going to reduce the ability and the rate in which you can contract quickly. So really, really, really long forms of static stretching prior to using them isn't always smart. But that being said, I've got an ankle mobility restriction. I do a lot of supplementary ankle mobility, and if I'm going to then go and use that ankle for a squat variation or something, I'll make sure I'll do something like some calf raises or some body weight squats, and I'll warm up maybe with an empty bar, like a light bar, and build up. So I'm not going straight from deep calf stretch, ankle stretch straight into the exercise. So you can very easily mitigate what are some of the potential issues when it comes to overdoing passive forms of stretching overall. I think it's important as well that I just sort of state what the differences are when it comes to mobility. So static stretching, like I said, is just like passive forms of long holds. But you might have also heard the expression active stretches or active mobility, and then dynamic mobility. So let's go back to the calf again. So we know that the calf stretch is actively dropping the heel towards the floor in that stretch position. If I wanted to actively if I wanted to do a form of active mobility on the ankle, now what I would need to do is actively pull into that position. So rather than having my weight hanging off the edge of a step, I could sit on the floor, my legs out in front of me, then I could try and actively use the muscles that pull the toes towards my knees to put my calf into a stretch that way. So it would co-contract the muscles the opposing side of the joint. That's active mobility. And you can do that on any joint. So I could passively put my leg up onto a ballet bar and do a hamstring stretch, or I could sit on the floor, sit my torso nice and tall, legs out straight, and I could try and use my hip flexor to actively raise my leg off the ground. So active stretches are that opposite side of the joint contracting to pull into a stretch. Nice, useful way to go about maybe if I was doing a static form of stretching and I wanted to go and use that muscle straight after, maybe I could just pair an active form of mobility on it. So static, passive hold, active, actively pulling into that range of motion. Dynamic mobility, I kind of think of as an umbrella term for just movement as a whole. Like I would almost consider a warm-up set. If I was doing a heavy squat for 80 kilos, I might do an empty bar, then add 10 kilos each side, go to 40 kilos, then add another 10 kilos each side to go to 60. I would almost consider that part of dynamic mobility. It could be like a walking lunge pattern. It could be anything, some push-ups, something that's taking you in and out of a range of motion. So static, active, and dynamic. I think this is really important that you choose joints that actually need to be mobilized. And I would put the most stock in foot and ankle, hips, the spine, the shoulder blades, and the shoulder girdle overall. So I've already spoken about the ankle mobility. And if you have that inability to sort of touch one knee against the wall, hips, when we think of hips, people probably think more about like hip flexors, like tension in the thighs, tension in the hamstrings, tension in the glutes. If you've ever heard of the stretch 90-90, so 90-90 or pigeon pose, they rotate the hip socket. And the hip joint has the greatest ability to express movement into rotation. So I'd put more emphasis on rotation. You also can get a lot of that if I'm doing an RDL, like taking a barbell down or dumbbell down RDL, or I'm doing a walking lunge, I'm going to express that hip flexion stretch and that hip extension stretch with those. But hip rotation isn't really touched on. So doing something like a supplementary 90-90 is a nice way to kind of cover your bases that aren't touched on with the strength exercises. The spine, because a lot of what we do in training is about bracing and stabilizing the spine. So I do think it's really smart to do something like a cat camel to flex and extend the spine, and to do some sort of rotation drill to twist and rotate the spine. Rotation of the spine is such an important movement overall. Recognize rotating the spine. If I'm sat here nice and tall, I can turn my ribcage to the side, and that rotates the sort of thoracic portion on the spine. If I was to lie back on the floor, so my ribcage is blocked on the ground, and I didn't allow my shoulders to come off the ground, and I put my feet together, knees together, and turn my legs to the side, that's going to turn my hips over to the side, and it's going to rotate the lumbar portion of the spine. So I can rotate the spine from the hips, I can rotate the spine from the ribcage. I think both of those are really, really useful. And then shoulders, I would say shoulders are probably one of the most complex part of the body when it comes to mobility overall. I really like things like hangs, going to a bar and sort of hanging. What are the problems with stretching and static forms of stretching? Let's say someone struggles to take their arms straight up over their head and clear their sort of ear with their bicep. The muscle that is underneath it that stops that is the big lat muscle in the armpit. And you see sort of people will anchor into a lat stretch. But the ability for the arm to go over the head is really dictated, or certainly massively influenced by the scapula, the shoulder blade's ability to articulate off the back of the rib cage. So having good sort of shoulder blade movement is important. So doing things that actually move the shoulder blade is important, rather than just like yanking the shoulder into a stretch overall. So again, I really like exercises that sort of like rotate the shoulders. If you've ever done any kind of like scapular cars, those sorts of things are really, really good. So just sort of like to finish off, I would strongly advise when it comes to your mobility that you pick things that you need to do and pick things that potentially your workout isn't going to cover. So hip rotation, spinal rotation, those sorts of things you're really not going to get much of from a strength training workout. So I think supplementary mobility is good. Not everyone needs to mobilize their ankles. Some people have very good ankle mobility. Some people have really good hip mobility. Some people have really good shoulder mobility. So you want to put emphasis into the ones that you actually want to improve. I think static and active forms of mobility are very useful. They're the ones that are probably going to create the most range improvements at a joint than just sort of a dynamic workout overall. But I put a lot of emphasis into full range of motion strength training. An example of that can be if you can do push-ups chest to floor. Well, the elbow going back behind the torso in a push-up is shoulder extension. Certainly if the elbows are quite close to the side, that's shoulder extension. But you're not going into maximal shoulder extension because your rib cage or your chest will touch the floor. So if I put my hand onto yoga blocks, now the floor's further away and I can take myself into a deeper position. So we can, with smart programming, we can start to really emphasize the ability to express more movement in these exercises. That being said, if I was doing that chest, that elevation on my push-ups, and I went low, my shoulders shrugged and my back really rounded, and I lost sort of like the integrity of the movement, then I'm compensating. So you do have to have an awareness of body position as you go through it. And just to finish up, I guess like how I started, think about what your body needs. If you're new to exercise, and maybe the most important thing for you is actually strength, and then trying to get full range of motion and cardio. If you're the kind of person that does tons of mobility all the time and you love it and it makes you feel good because you're good at it, actually maybe you're better off putting your time into cardio and strength training. It really does depend on the person. And I'm a big fan of sort of minimum effective dose. I certainly, as a younger individual, did a lot of like what I would consider pseudo bodybuilding, and ended up with quite poor mobility overall. I wanted to do a pistol squat, which is a squat variation that needs a lot of ankle mobility, a lot of hip mobility, and a lot of control of my body through space. So I spent a good year really working on my ability to get into that. And then since actually achieving that feat, I've been able to maintain a really good level of mobility with quite a low dose to it. So I'm a big fan of sort of like quality over quantity, unless you're chasing something or unless you're after something very specific to that. But then just to remember that strength training through full range of motion will cover a lot of your bases overall. So smart strength training program with a little bit of supplementary mobility will really do everything that you need. So hopefully that kind of clears up some confusion around some of the categories of mobility around static, active, and dynamic. It gives you a little bit of understanding of the difference between mobility and flexibility and how we can use strength training to really cover a lot of our bases, and then where maybe supplementary mobility could be important and additive on top of that.